Chicago Bears fans are optimistic about what this year's team can do with Caleb Williams. And it feels like more energy and enthusiasm about the direction of the team than we've seen in years.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. On the show today, we compare the excitement and optimism around this year's Chicago Bears team to some recent years when we've also been at this stage of the offseason excited about what the year was going to bring, thinking that the progress they made the year before, it's going to carry over into the next year. The team is going to take a big step forward or maybe continue some of the success that they've had and be able to kind of combine and sustain, that's the word I was looking for, some of the success that this team has had. And obviously in the last really decade or two, it hasn't sustained, but something does feel a little bit different about where this team is now, and we can kind of compare and contrast along the way where this Bears team stands. I think it's important that we, before we go back to the past, that we really understand why and where there is so much enthusiasm, optimism, energy around this Bears team now. Why so much of it is justified in many ways. Now, it can be justified. It doesn't mean they're going to win 13 games and then win the division and go on a Super Bowl run this year. But I think there's good reason to believe this team will be better this season, and that or at least there's good sound logic behind thinking this team can make a little bit more noise this season than we've seen the last couple of years around. I mean, obviously it's all about Caleb Williams first and foremost being a difference maker at the quarterback position and the best quarterback the Bears have drafted in terms of talent that they're getting right out of the start of the draft. The only time they've ever gotten the number one overall pick, the only time they've ever taken the best quarterback, the consensus best quarterback in a draft, entering the draft, the can't miss, hands down, you got to get this guy type prospect. I mean, we've spent all offseason talking about how great Caleb Williams is. We don't have to rehash all of those talking points and reasonings here, but then you add into that everything they've been able to put around him on offense and so many of the pieces back on defense. I mean, the type of wide receiver talent the Bears have right now is some of the best we've seen ever in this city. I mean, we can debate that versus, Brandon Marshall and Alshon Jeffrey and Martellus Bennett and some of the other wide receiver cores of recent years. The Bears have had some decent receiving cores, but Keenan Allen and DJ Moore both being Pro Bowl 1,000-yard receivers plus Rome Odunze. I mean, this is probably the best set of skill position talent any Bears quarterback has had in my lifetime. Again, there were some of those years, and we'll actually talk about a couple of those years with Jeffrey and Marshall and Matt Forte and Brent and Martellus Bennett and, but this is legit weapons around a quarterback. Plus you've got optimism for the offensive line, a largely young and ascending group, not a surefire, top 10 bona fide studs across the board, but reason to suspect they could be decent and certainly not a ton of fear that they're going to be terrible, but most likely maybe somewhere kind of along the middle. But still all those weapons plus, maybe average offensive line should be enough for Caleb Williams and for this offense to be very successful in this first season. Then on defense, you're bringing back your entire starting group except for Yannick Ngakoue at this stage of the process, including a back, and then Eddie Jackson, I suppose. You got to swap him out for Kevin Byard. But you've got a really solid core on this defense that played really well at the end of last year. A young secondary that's really hitting its stride, and guys are kind of growing into their prime, into their peaks at this stage of the process. I mean, they're not even quite at their absolute best yet, and they've already looked like a really stellar lockdown group on the back end as recently as last season. Like, they're ready to keep progressing forward. 2 solid veteran linebackers in the middle. And then also this Montez Sweat guy that we still haven't even seen a full season of him on this defensive line, and what he can fully do now that he's had an offseason with this team and is not just trying to learn on the fly when he's thrown in the fire halfway through the season. Obviously, questions about the rest of this defensive line. I think you're seeing, especially among Chicago Bears fans, enough optimism about the likes of Gervon Dexter taking a step forward, DeMarcus Walker getting back to some of the better play that we saw from him earlier in his career, and then a 5th-round rookie like Austin Booker, or maybe some development from Dominique Robinson or Zach Pickens. Like, I think when you talk to Bears fans, you get this feeling like they're not that every position is a top 5 position group in the NFL, but like that this team's weaknesses are not aggressively concerning, and that they've got options at their biggest weak points that you can feel pretty good about. And then their strengths are very strong, in the secondary, and with Montez Sweat, with the receivers, and the skill position talent that can all sort of come together here with Shane Waldron at calling the offense here to put this team in a position to win 9, 10 plus games, depending on how optimistic of a Bears fan you talk about. Like, there's just so much of this confidence around this team right now that like things are set in a way that feels just a little bit differently than past times things have felt set. Like, we've had flashes of success and seasons of success and reasons to be excited and optimistic about teams moving forward, but it doesn't always felt as like this version feels a little bit more secure right now, because it does feel like it's just sort of scratching the surface, that there's optimism that this season is going to be much better and something really, fun for this team, but also that this season isn't like all in the peak, now or never, boom or bust type of time. That this season is just the warm up, and even the warm up can be a lot better and a lot more fun and a lot more optimistic than what this team's, real window is a couple of years down the line up to this point. Whereas some of the past teams I think we've been really excited and optimistic about, we were a little bit more pinpointed on, like, now is kind of the time here, that it's not so much a long-term thing. And in some cases, it's varying degrees, but not so much like the beginning of something special, but like, okay, it's got to be something special now. And then, of course, it doesn't always pan out to be. So I want to kind of compare, okay, the optimism of this year compared to, say, last year. There was a lot of optimism about this Bears team with year 2 of Luke Getsy and Justin Fields and adding DJ Moore. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I also want to look back to the year after the Bears went to the playoffs and had the 12-4 season under Matt Nagy, the double doink, and a lot of optimism coming into the year after that. It was like, oh, they could have gone on a big run, and they're going to keep that momentum going. And then even back a little bit further to one of the Mark Trestman years and the last Lovie Smith year. Really, I think had a lot of optimism behind it based on what they had done the year before. So we'll kind of compare where this team is now and where they've been, about 5 years ago and more about like 10 years ago. That's next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by BetterHelp. BetterHelp provides online therapy that's here to help you be your best self. If you find yourself comparing your life to other people, and certainly social media and just life in general has us always sort of pitted against each other a little bit. Comparison is definitely the thief of joy, and a service like BetterHelp can help you focus on what you want and what is best for you versus what others have, so you can start living your best life. Online therapy is designed for you to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. With BetterHelp, you just fill out a questionnaire and then they match you with a licensed therapist, and then you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. If you've been thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try, because you need to stop comparing and start focusing. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. We've been in this position before where we're entering training camp and even into the regular season, really excited about what this Bears team can be. That you go through an offseason of exciting additions, whether it's free agency, trade, draft, sometimes coaching changes, although not as much of that, year one optimism in that regard. But like the offseason of everything is getting better. Things are trending in the right direction. The reports from OTAs and minicamp are great. And like, okay, we're excited about what this Bears team can be. We're talking 10, 11 wins. We're talking playoffs. We're talking competing for the NFC North. And you're already hearing a lot about that, about this team right now this year. But we've done it before, and it certainly hasn't really panned out that way. And that's not me saying it's not going to pan out this season, but it's more so it's interesting to me, like, to try and capture the differences between what we're feeling now and what we felt in the past. Like, even as recent as last season, entering 2023, there was a feeling like, okay, they had just finished tanking in 2022, tore down the roster, and everything was bad. Of course, we knew it was going to be bad, but it was kind of like intentionally bad. But even in 2022, that offense started clicking in the second half of the season, with Fields running the ball quite a bit, and they made some noise. They didn't win, but they were doing some damage and scoring a lot of points, and then the defense was kind of falling apart a little bit. So, you go from a pretty dismal, torn down roster in 2022, and then you have that offseason of 2023 to really start adding a bit more around Justin Fields when you have the number 1 overall pick and you have some salary cap space to go out in free agency and add more players. Of course, the DJ Moore trade becomes everything at that point. You got Justin Fields, a true number 1 wide receiver. They also, at that point, then had just traded for Chase Claypool during the previous season. So we were entering 2023 thinking Moore, Mooney, and Claypool could be a pretty formidable 1, 2, 3 receiver group. Obviously, they did not become that way, but during the offseason, we were excited about what that group was going to be able to do. Plus, defensively, they get Yannick Ngakoue right before training camp. They added the linebackers, Edwards and Edmonds, in free agency. You've got some more draft picks invested in the secondary with Tyreek Stevenson. You got the young guys coming back from the year before in Jaquan Brisker and Kyler Gordon. And it was like, okay, you've got pieces on this defense, so that group should be better. You've got real weapons for Justin Fields, so that group should be better. And you use the first-round pick on Darnell Wright. Like, you've addressed the offensive line, you've addressed receivers, you've addressed the defense, and now it's no longer Fields' first year in this offense. Now he can cook a little bit more and be ready to take that next step forward. And I remember that feeling like it wasn't necessarily that the Bears were going to go from worst record in the league to Super Bowl, but there were people predicting Bears going worst to first in the NFC North division, right? Like that they could maybe be a 9 or 10 win team, kind of like we're talking about for this season. Obviously, it didn't pan out that way, and in hindsight, there were more problems with the offense than we realized from a play calling standpoint. There was probably more developing we thought Justin Fields would develop more and would take a bigger step forward than he ultimately did. Of course, then, Chase Claypool doesn't pan out, Robert Tonyan doesn't pan out, the defensive coordinator vanishes under mysterious purposes. The offensive line is injured for most of the season. And while the defense was still good, right, there were a lot of these things that just all didn't go wrong. Yet there was still plenty of reason to feel optimistic going in from one year to the next. But it still feels like this current year is a little bit more of like a grounded optimism. And there's veterans. All you can point to right now is maybe some questions on the O-line and maybe some questions in the D-line. But there is no questioning the back seven of this defense and the skill position around Caleb Williams. This is as rock solid as you could hope for in that regard. I also think back to the last time the Bears made the playoffs? The last time the Bears made noise in the playoffs. I think they made it a second time under Matt Nagy. But 12-4, 2018, right? The Mitch Trubisky, Matt Nagy year. The defense dominates. They make it to the playoffs against the Eagles. Ends in the missed field goal that we all know about. But after that year, it was like, oh man, the Bears were 12-4. This Matt Nagy offense is taking the league by storm. This defense is absolutely loaded, and they had some weapons for Mitch Trubisky between, Allen Robinson they had brought in, and of course, Tariq Cohen and Jordan Howard in the backfield, Taylor Gabriel, Trey Burton at tight end. Offensive line had some young pieces in there, and of course, again, really, really solid defense. 2018 and 2019, this team is going from 12-4. We are feeling it. Let's go. And really that offseason of 2019, before the after the playoff loss, and you go through that offseason, you didn't lose a ton, right? Adrian Amos leaves, Bryce Callahan leaves, and the big one was probably Vic Fangio leaving, replaced him with Chuck Pagano. But as far as the players on defense, right? You still had your pass rush. You still had Khalil Mack, you still had Leonard Floyd, Danny Trevathan, Roquan Smith, Eddie Goldman. You had a lot of your key pieces across the board on defense. Your offense didn't change all that much from year to year, and it was another year of Trubisky and Nagy to be able to take that step forward. And yet, things really didn't go well in that year of Matt Nagy. You end up, of course, eventually moving on from that coach, but you kind of hit this wall of okay, maybe the defense did take a step back, and maybe they didn't do enough to keep the offensive line together or to sort of boost the offensive line a little bit more. And maybe Mitch Trubisky, much like this last year with Fields, like if they thought Trubisky would take this step forward in the second year in the same offense with decent weapons around him, and it didn't ultimately end up happening. And I think that's kind of the takeaway here when I compare the optimism about Caleb Williams right now versus the optimism of the last couple times here with Nagy in 2019 or with Fields last season. Like, it was, you're counting on this quarterback to make a step forward and for that cohesion in the offense to be what develops him. And in both of these cases, it didn't happen. And that's going to be so critical then for Caleb Williams this year that, okay, you can have all the great weapons around him. You can have a great defense behind him. You can have a decent offensive line around him. That's great. But if offensive coordinator and quarterback don't produce the kind of development that you'll need to see from them, that's what keeps you most often, at least in recent Bears history, from fully realizing that potential and that excitement for this team. And it's sort of like then banking on Caleb and Shane Waldron being different than Fields and Trubisky. And like we kind of said, like there's reason to think he can be, given that he's the number one overall pick, that he's the consensus top quarterback. Neither of those other two QBs were that. Trubisky was the first quarterback taken, but it was not clearly like, oh yes, everyone wants Mitch Trubisky. He is the unquestioned best quarterback in that draft class. And Fields was the fourth or fifth quarterback taken in his draft, 10th overall or 11th overall, whatever it was. And so like there are always going to be lingering questions about either of those quarterbacks. And of course, Caleb is no sure thing, but at least you can feel like there was no question he was going to be the quarterback decision with the number one overall pick. And then with Waldron, it's kind of hard to compare Waldron to Nagy and to Luke Getsy, because I think we were all convinced Nagy was going to be very good. I think we were all convinced after the first season that there was something to like about Luke Getsy. Maybe we weren't all convinced that Getsy was a future head coach or that he was, a genius offensive coordinator, but I don't think we thought it was going to be that bad, right? And so, I mean, Shane Waldron is going to be critical. That's why at the beginning of this offseason, I said the most important decision the Chicago Bears are going to make this year was offensive coordinator. It was a more important decision than quarterback when it was all said and done, because he's going to be the one who decides or is in charge of and shapes how well this quarterback does. And that's where the Bears have come up short in this optimism in the past handful of seasons here. But I wanted to dig a little bit further back to a couple of times when, a quarterback wasn't so much a question mark. We knew who it was going to be. We knew what you were getting with him. There were ups and downs, certainly with one Jay Cutler, but like we weren't sitting there going, man, quarterback is the problem here. Offensive coordinator was sometimes the problem. Defense was sometimes the problem. Other things around the quarterback were the problem, but there was a lot of feeling like, man, they just haven't been able to properly support this quarterback. But a couple of times you get your hopes up like, oh man, like they might have it here. They've got something here. And we were able to get optimistic that, okay, this next year with Jay Cutler was going to be that year that they go on that run. Obviously, like 2010 was the run, but since 2010, like they came close a couple times, and we thought like, oh, the next year might be that year. But I want to go back through kind of a couple of back-to-back sections here, where it's not two back-to-back years, but it's sort of like only a year in between. There were a couple moments where we thought we were close, and then we didn't ultimately end up getting there in 2012 and 2014. Things didn't go great, but there was a lot of reason to think they could have had things gone differently, and I want to also compare that to where we are today next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, America's number one sportsbook. And it's America's number one sportsbook because all summer long, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Even though, basketball and hockey playoffs are over and football season is just on the horizon, there's still plenty to play with at FanDuel.com. Whether it's the baseball season, the soccer tournaments going on right now, tennis and golf, racing as well. But you can also bet ahead on this NFL season with the line for Bears-Titans Week 1 favoring the Bears by 4.5 at home. You can bet on Matt Eberflus' Coach of the Year odds, Caleb Williams' Offensive Rookie of the Year odds, his passing yards, Roma Dunze's receiving yards, and so much more, all in the FanDuel app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So to start getting your daily boost or bonus, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of Major League Baseball. Before 2019, we kind of went on a stretch of rough Bears seasons where there wasn't really a time during the John Fox era where we were like, oh man, this team's going to go on a run. This team is ready to make that jump. It was kind of like just trying to dig themselves back out of a hole that they had gotten in from things kind of crashing and burning before that. But before they crashed and burned, there was a lot of thought and optimism and hope about this Bears team entering year 2 of Mark Trestman. Year 1, 2013, Trestman comes in and finally an offensive mastermind, or so we thought, coming to Chicago to bring the offense here into the 21st century. And it really did feel that way in 2013. They went 8-8, but like between Cutler and Josh McCown, Cutler missed a few games. They threw for like 4,500 yards combined, not individually, but combined. And of course, that offense was when you started assembling Alshon Jeffrey, Brandon Marshall, Martellus Bennett on that offense with Matt Forte in the backfield. You still had some veterans on that offensive line, plus they drafted Kyle Long and Jordan Mills that year, so you kind of had some young and some old there. Like things were starting to build up on that regard. And the defense was no longer the Lovie Smith defense, but you still had Lance Briggs, you still had Julius Peppers, you still had Charles Tillman and Tim Jennings, and they win 8-8, the offense is rolling, and okay, let's start to retool then in 2024. In year 2 of Trestman and Cutler, that's when things are going to take this next step. That's when they win 8-8, and they're ready to kind of take off from there, is kind of what the feeling was in that 2014 offseason, especially because they go out in free agency, and they get Jared Allen. They had Lamar Houston. They had Willie Young. The pass rush is bolstered. You still have all the weapons together offensively, plus you've got a year more of experience from your rookies like Kyle Long and Jordan Mills. Like your offensive line should be a little bit more solid as a result. Then you add some of these pieces back on the defense, and you've got Tim Jennings and Kyle Fuller. And Kyle Fuller drafted that year. You still did have Charles Tillman as a part of that 2014 defense, although he got hurt during that season. So it was like, all right, like you added all these pieces to the defense. That should be improved. You already had all these weapons for the offense. It's, again, another year of Cutler and Trestman, and then obviously the Mel Tucker defense pretty well falls apart there. The locker room fractures. I believe Jay Cutler got hurt again that season and in a more significant way. I'm going to double check how many games he played that season. He played 15. Okay, no, he was healthy for most of that 2014 season, but the team goes 5-11 because they have the worst defense in football, and even the offense took a pretty significant step back there. Marshall was hurt for a couple games. We didn't really get a lot from the rest of the other pieces on that offense, except for Matt Forte, who had a really, really great season, but that just wasn't enough, especially with the defense that was so bad. And then, of course, everything falls apart with Trestman and et cetera, and it gets super, super messy. But, like, that was a year where I think maybe we talked ourselves into the defense being better than it was ever going to be there, like, unrealistically, like, thought it would be more fixed than it was, but really it was just kind of putting lipstick on a pig there, and that we also maybe didn't realize the full extent of the coaching issues, that Trestman could call a good offense but not lead a locker room, and that was a little bit harder to see on the outside entering the 2014 season. But like, I think that was the preseason where there was the reportedly like I remember like Kyle Fuller get into fights at practice and training camp. I remember there being rumors of a Jared Allen punch thrown in the locker room at some point during that process. Like there was a lot of rumors and messiness that was slowly coming out at the beginning of that season that eventually trickled out. Was that also the year where your offensive line coach, offensive coordinator Aaron Cromer, leaked to the media that it was Cutler's fault, and then it kind of came out that he was the one who leaked that quote? I mean, that was just... But some those kind of things that were a little bit hard for us on the outside to be able to fully predict. So, like, I don't think it's a neat, easy comparison to where we are right now. I mean, we assume that Matt Eberflus is doing a good job leading the locker room. The locker room seems to be solid and steady, but at the same time, it just had to replace both coordinators, one of which left under very mysterious circumstances that we know nothing about. Like, could that be a red flag that we are overlooking or not properly accounting for the way we maybe did with Trestman years ago? Not to put Eberflus and Trestman in the same category, but like just trying to like look back at previous times when we were as optimistic as we are now about this Bears team, because that team had all the weapons in the world. That team had new pieces added to the defense, but the new pieces didn't all come together and didn't all work the way they were supposed to. And at least with this current Bears team, this defense is very, very strongly established, and we're not relying on a bunch of moving parts to all come together the way they were back then in 2014. Let's go one more recent historic Bears team, just a little over a decade ago. The last Lovie Smith season, 2012. Entering that season, I think there was some feeling like maybe Lovie's leash was running out a little bit, but I remember personally being really optimistic about what that team could do in 2011, based on what, or in 2012, based on what they had done in 2011. 2011 was the year where they started 7-3 and were lighting the league on, not lighting the league on fire, that's probably too optimistic, but like the Bears were getting hot and playing really well. It was some of the best football we'd seen in the Jay Cutler era. Then Cutler gets hurt throwing that interception against the Chargers or the Raiders. I think it was the Raiders game, because I think it was on the road in Oakland, if I remember correctly. Cutler gets hurt. No, it would have been the Chargers game. No, it was the Chargers game. Okay, because Haney started that Raiders game. Cutler gets hurt. They lose out basically the rest of the season, or they lose like 5 or 6 straight games, 1, 2, 3, 5 straight games, and miss the playoffs and finish 8-8 in what was a disappointment. But like, oh man, we felt like that 2011 Bears team, if Cutler had stayed healthy, they were going to be right back in the playoffs, maybe right back in the NFC Championship game, and ready to go on another nice run there. But instead, it's just that Jay Cutler injury away from everything working out nicely. So 2012, okay, Jay Cutler's healthy again, and Mike Martz is out of here. Great. All right, can this offense upgrade a little bit with Mike Tice coming in as the offensive coordinator? He was the offensive line coach, so maybe the offensive line can get even better as well. And of course, then between 2011 and 2012, who do they trade for? But Brandon Marshall, Jay Cutler's best receiver from Denver. Plus, they draft Alshon Jeffrey in the second round. So in 2012, you got Jay Cutler back healthy, a new offensive coordinator, plus Marshall, Jeffrey, and Matt Forte, some great new weapons for Jay. Your new OC's an O-line guy, so hopefully the offensive line can be better. And you've still got that Lovie Smith defense in 2012. It's still Urlacher and Briggs. It's still Charles Tillman and Tim Jennings, and you got Julius Peppers, Henry Melton, Israel Donajay. Like, all right, you've got a real offense for Jay. You've got the Lovie Smith defense. This should be good. Like, let's go. Let's get it. And, for whatever reason, the defense ends up playing a little bit older than, they were aging and maybe weren't as stellar as they used to be. You still got, your occasional Cutler's mistakes, but the offense didn't really take that huge step forward. It was better, but it wasn't like a lights out best year of Jay Cutler's career. He actually didn't have a super productive season overall compared to what he had been doing. I mean, he finished with 3,000 yards and 19 touchdowns or whatever. They still won 10 games. They went 10-6, but that was third in the NFC North and missed the playoffs, and you fire Lovie Smith. Like, they did have a better year, so the optimism was a little bit justified, but it wasn't like everything we thought they could have been in that season. And that's where, they just came up short. Maybe we underestimated the age of the defense and that falling apart, starting to wear down a little bit. Maybe the league catching up to Lovie Smith a little bit more than we thought. And maybe we gave Mike Tice too much credit and thought, okay, you throw all these weapons in the offense with a new coordinator and it'll all work right away. And maybe that wasn't quite instant fix. I don't know, is the comparison there to this year that the Bears have all these new weapons and this new quarterback and a new offense, and we expect the offense to right away be a well-oiled machine, and maybe it won't be a well-oiled machine? Like, I think that might be a valid way to kind of like pump the brakes a little bit here and say, okay, yeah, it is still a little bit of a work in progress here. We do need to be patient with it and give it time and not expect that this offense is going to dominate from the get-go the moment they take the field, especially with a rookie quarterback. So I think that puts some good context on the optimism surrounding this Bears team. By all means, be excited about it. That's the fun part about sports. I'm not here to tell you don't be optimistic. This team isn't going to be any good. Don't get your hopes up. No, absolutely, get your hopes up. This team is going to be good. This team is going to be fun, and we should absolutely all enjoy it. I hope that the Locked On Bears podcast helps make it that much more enjoyable for you. In exchange, I hope that you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to the podcast. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. If you're looking for your second listen today, check out the Locked On NFL podcast. I've been filling in back-to-back days there. If you want a little bit more of me talking football here in the Locked On Podcast Network, check out Locked On NFL on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. We're just a few weeks away from Bears training camp. We'll be ramping back up to a full 5 days a week at that point. But for now, we're still going to take it easy. Probably only 3 days this week. Maybe next podcast might be a Friday podcast at this point. We'll see how things shake out. But in the meantime, I hope that you still find some opportunities to enjoy your 4th of July holiday and bear down.